Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Paulina Boyko, and today we're talking about the government's new alcohol strategy, in particular, the introduction of minimum per unit pricing of alcohol. It's regarded as one of the biggest public health interventions in the UK in years. The government wants to set a minimum price of 40 pence per unit of alcohol and is considering stricter control over advertising rules and multi-buy deals. There's been a mixed reaction to the coalition's efforts to tackle what David Cameron calls the scourge of violence caused by binge drinking. But is minimum pricing going to be effective? Some say that minimum pricing punishes everyone, the innocent and the guilty. And what about the responsible drinkers in the low-income bracket, who are about to experience a price hike? To discuss one of the biggest public health initiatives since Labour brought in the smoking ban back in 2006, I'm joined in the studio by James Morris from Alcohol Policy UK, Gavin Partington, Interim Chief Executive at the Wine and Spirit Trade Association, and Professor Alan Marion Davis, Honorary Professor of Public Health from the Department of Public Health Sciences at King's College London. And on the phone from Russia, we have Erkin Tuzmuhamedov from Russia's Association of Sommeliers and an expert on Russia's alcohol traditions. So alcohol concerns say that 1 in 4 adults in the UK are binge drinkers. We keep seeing newspaper headlines about Booze Britain and the number of young people in particular who are abusing alcohol. How did this come about? And is minimum pricing going to be an effective way of tackling the problem? Alan, what's your take on the situation?
Well, I think the binge drinking is very much a young person's thing. Certainly, not just middle classes, but actually more in lower income households, and a lot of binge drinking in the under 18s. We have an 18-year-old legal lowest age for drinking, but a lot of it goes on amongst school children as well. So that's a big issue, and it's still such a problem that something has to be done. And really, it centres on, if you look at the evidence, it centres on two main things: price and availability in particular. And that particular group of young people, particularly the underage ones, don't have much disposable income. They're pretty poor, and the way they get their drink very largely is by going into supermarkets, stores where there are very cheap alcohol deals. Big offers, very generous offers. Sometimes at what we call pocket money prices. You can buy some strong white cider, which is an alcoholic apple drink, for less than the price of a bottle of water. Very, very cheap. And these young people are loading up on this before they go out for the evening. We call it preloading, and they can get themselves very merry indeed before they go out on the town and have to start spending big money. So it is a big issue, and the price of alcohol is crucially important in that, and that's why we're, from the public health point of view, very keen on our Prime Minister's initiative, and it's a bold initiative, I think, to say quite plainly that the policy will be to put a floor on the minimum price.
Gavin, you come from a different standpoint. What do you think about it?
Well, our view is that minimum unit pricing will be unlikely to work because the international evidence suggests that the heaviest drinkers, people who drink at problematic levels, are least likely to be deterred from drinking overall by rises in price. And that sort of stands to reason, really. If you've got a problem with alcohol, if you're determined to obtain it, you'll go to every length to do so. So we believe it's a policy proposal that is ultimately likely to impose a burden on many, many people who don't have a problem with alcohol consumption. And if there is a group who's likely to be hit hardest by it, it is the poor, it's those on low incomes. Now, Alan raised a number of interesting points. On a couple of things, I'd actually say he's factually incorrect, if I may say so, because the assertion that the bulk of people who are under 18 obtain their alcohol by going into shops, that's not correct. In fact, the research conducted by health researchers up in the northwest of England suggests that a large number of under 18s obtain their alcohol from their parents.
Well, I didn't say the bulk.
And this is an area of concern. And I think it raises a couple of points. One is, should we be using price as a mechanism to deter people who are not legally entitled to drink from drinking? There's a sort of moral question about policy there. Generally, it seems to me that if people are not legally entitled to drink, we should be using the law to prevent them from doing so. The second point is this. We do need to engage with parents here. We do not have enough education in our society around the risks of excessive alcohol consumption. And if indeed, and I believe this is the case, that most kids are getting their alcohol from their parents, we need to engage with parents on that and get the message across more clearly.
James, is this a tax on responsible drinkers?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, actually, if you look at a 40 or even 50 pence minimum per unit price, and most people who drink alcohol, most people won't be affected by this price change. I think practically any drink bought on trade premises, pubs, clubs, restaurants, those drinks won't be affected. Even most supermarket drinks or off-licence drinks are not affected by a 50 pence minimum price. It is those drinks that are targeted by heavy or problem drinkers, people deliberately going out to get drunk. So if you look at a 2-litre bottle of white cider, which might have a large number of units in it, that's the sort of drink that would be targeted by minimum per unit price. So I don't think it does tackle the responsible majority. But a point that Gavin made about it, I think there is a valid point in the fact that dependent or problem drinkers who do have an alcohol dependency will continue to drink, and the impact it has on them is something that warrants further attention. However, this is a public health intervention and something called prevention paradox, which is actually that it's often more effective to reduce overall levels of harm by actually looking for a small effect in a larger group of people than actually targeting a small number of individuals with existing problems. And actually, Alcohol Concerns point about 1 in 4 people drinking at a level that could be harmful to their health is crucial here, because there's about 26% of the population, the adult population in England, who drink at a level that's above the guidelines.
Just to remind you, you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Paulina Boyko, and today we're discussing the UK government's new alcohol strategy and the introduction of minimum unit pricing. To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by James Morris from Alcohol Policy UK, Gavin Partington, Interim Chief Executive at the Wine and Spirit Trade Association, Professor Alan Marion Davis, Honorary Professor of Public Health from the Department of Public Health Sciences at King's College London, and on the phone from Russia we have Erkin Tuzmuhamedov from Russia's Association of Sommeliers and an expert on Russia's alcohol traditions. Let's switch to Russia for a moment. Now, the average Russian consumes about 18 litres of pure alcohol each year, one of the highest rates in the world. A recent study said that drinking has caused more than half of deaths among Russians aged 15 to 54 since the 1991 Soviet collapse. The Russian government has also, like the British government, brought in a number of new measures and campaigns to deal with the problem. How big a problem is the abuse of alcohol in Russian society, and which measures have been effective in reducing alcoholism?
Raising the minimal pricing of alcohol in Russia, I think this wouldn't be effective at all. The situation in Russia is probably a little slightly different from what you have in the UK. The current proposals are to gradually raise the minimum price of a bottle of vodka to $10, which is a lot. 300 rubles, this is a lot. Currently, the cheapest vodka, half a liter, costs here, legal vodka, not counterfeit vodka, 98 rubles, which is roughly $3, 2 pounds for half a liter. So they're planning to raise it like 3 times, which is a lot, because the level of living in this country, most of the population lives beyond poverty, believe it. Unfortunately, in the rural parts of Russia, the level of the standards of living are very, very low, extremely low. So this is unaffordable. I think what would be effective in this country to introduce some kind of a social vodka, because if a person wants to drink, if he is an alcoholic, he will find ways to do it. We had a lot of experiments in this in the last 30 years. We all remember Gorbachev, who is considered to be a hero in the West. He's not that popular here in Russia, partly because of his anti-alcoholic stand. He introduced the dry law, the so-called dry law, in May '85. And there was a joke coming from that period of time when a kid asks a father who is a drunkard, "Father, they're going to raise the price of vodka. Will you drink less?" The father answers, "No, kid, you will eat less." So the view here is different. Another silly, absolutely silly, crazy thing that Gorbachev tried to introduce, in some parts of Russia, he started selling vodka in 3-liter jars. Imagine 3-liter jars. In Russian, the tradition is if you open a bottle, you have to down it. You will rarely see in rural parts of Russia, and even in the cities, that an open bottle is kept till tomorrow or stays in a cupboard. The thing which you often see anywhere in the West, you open a bottle of cognac and it lasts for a month.
Gavin, do you have something to say about these Russian policies?
What Ergin ties in there is a pattern of behaviour in Russia. In fact, if you look broadly at Europe, you see patterns of binge drinking, heavier consumption in the very countries that have high levels of taxation and high prices of alcohol relatively in Europe, Scandinavian countries, the UK, Ireland. The UK, with the current budget, became the highest priced place for a bottle of wine around Europe. And yet the countries in southern Europe, where prices are lowest, an average price for a bottle of wine in Spain, for example, is £1.50, as compared to about £4.90 here. The countries that seem to have a far healthier, balanced relationship with alcohol, where there is a pattern of moderate consumption, where alcohol is partaken with food, characteristically, and they don't seem to have this pattern of binge drinking. So I wonder whether there is a broader, a deeper cultural issue that we need to address here.
Alan?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, could it be something to do with the climate, very, very cold, but also very, very dark in winter, and the way societies are operating in these northern latitudes, people feel that every now and again they've just got to get together and cheer themselves up.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I suspect that is why there is this pattern in northern European, in Scandinavia particularly.
I think the key thing is about affordability, though, and in the UK, one of the key graphs that advocates of minimum pricing show is that over the last 30 years, or 40 or 50 years, where there's been a substantial rise in affordability of alcohol, that's been correlated quite closely with a rise in consumption. And Sweden is an interesting example where alcohol prices are higher, but yet they are very high. Have high binge drinking rates, and that's interesting and unclear in some ways. But there is a greater overall proportion of wealth and equality in the country. So you could argue that more people.
Sweden is an anomaly in that sense.
Well, I think it's too simplified just to say because the price is higher that doesn't prove that minimum pricing won't work. It's a subtle effect, but there could be lots of reasons, and climate could be part of it. But also, Sweden is one of the most equal countries, so there's a smaller gap between the rich and the poor, so there's a greater middle class or wealth where they can afford to drink despite higher prices.
One of the other things there that strikes me about this is that when you're looking at patterns of consumption, we have to address an issue here in this country that overall levels of consumption have come down in recent years.
Yes.
I mean, you touched on this earlier. You were talking about the changes and shifts that we've seen, and overall consumption has come down 13% since 2004, and yet the reported health farms that you yourself have witnessed in the public health community seem to have risen in certain areas. And that seems to be an anomaly, and I wonder therefore, are we right to try and tackle overall consumption, or should we be focusing policy on a target group?
That's precisely where minimum pricing scores, because that's what minimum pricing is doing. It's focusing the problem, focusing the solution, as it were, or a solution, on a particular group of people who buy the ultra cheap drink. The overall consumption of alcohol may be going down, but then more is being drunk by those that drink, as it were. Those people who drink alcohol, they're actually consuming more. And if we focus on minimum pricing of particularly cheap deals, then I think that is actually quite a focus group. Just a myth about minimum pricing. A lot of people think this is going to raise the prices of drink overall. Of course, it's not. As James was saying, it doesn't affect pubs and clubs and restaurants. It's really just in the retail section where people buy buy in stores and supermarkets. So it's not going to raise the general price. It literally just produces a floor price below which the retailer is not allowed to sell the booze. And what happens is that the retailers are given a kind of if you can think of it as given a certain amount of a budget in which they can offer savings on various lines, and it's up to them to decide either at head office or sometimes in the local store.
So with this, they'll be able to make a tin of beans 3 pence.
Yes, if they want to. Of course, the trouble is what they want to do is usually really deeply cut on just on few lines in order to attract people into the store as a loss leader. So they're unlikely to spread it all across all the foodstuffs. But there's no reason why they shouldn't bring down some good wines down, from say £6 a bottle to £5 a bottle, or the same with beers, down. What we won't have is that ultra cheap own label. Fairly rough stuff.
Can I just pick up on that? Because you've raised some interesting points there, some of which are blatantly inaccurate and actually have been attested to be so by the Institute of Fiscal Studies this week in its analysis of minimum unit pricing, which shows that, indeed, minimum unit pricing, even at 40 pence, would have a burden on ordinary consumers and responsible drinkers. It would impose a price rise for them that is non-negligible. It is an increase of something like... It's non-negligible, and actually, the truth is that it's an increase for people about whom there is no evidence that they drink at harmful levels. And if I may say so, your evidence and your assertions about the way the retail market operates are not borne out by experience. The truth is that retailers do not, on the whole now, subsidise alcohol by selling it at below cost, and indeed have been planning to implement the government's ban on below-cost selling, which was due to come in on April the 6th, although they've now rescinded that.
I wasn't talking about below cost.
James?
I mean, there's several ways to look at this, and as I've said before, a minimum price isn't the solution, but I think we do have to recognise, and what I kind of think David Cameron's point is that it's partly about changing the culture and what are the ways of achieving that, and part of it is about messaging, and I do think that it's important to remember that alcohol is not an ordinary commodity. It is a potentially addictive, potentially dangerous, lethal drug. So yes, the majority of people use it responsibly and without harms, but it is potentially a dangerous drug. And so what's the message that we send out by selling alcohol for less than water or Coca-Cola and having it just very normalised as an ordinary commodity? I think that's part of what the culture is. And so with all drugs, with all markets, there's a balance between regulation and not regulation. I think, we could look at drug policies and say that a complete ban on illicit drugs is a failed war on drugs, and that regulation's gone too far in that respect. But with alcohol, have we got that balance quite right? And I don't quite think so, and that's why we have the problematic culture that we have, and price plays an important role in that.
Just to remind you, you're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Paulina Boyko, and today we're discussing the UK government's new alcohol strategy and the introduction of minimum unit pricing. What about the proposed late-night levy to charge bars that are open late in order to fund extra policing? How much did 24-hour licensing laws affect the issue of alcohol abuse and binge drinking in the UK? And will the government's proposed levy reverse this problem? Gavin, what's your take on the levy?
Well, the notion of 24-hour licensing, I'm afraid, is one of those Daily Mail myths that has been perpetuated in recent years and isn't actually the reality. Most 24-hour licenses belong to hotels, in fact, and establishments in which you can't gain proper public access. Most retail outlets that have a 24-hour license only use them occasionally. The idea that licensing has triggered the sort of cultural pattern of behaviour of binge drinking that we see on a Friday or Saturday night, or, dare I say it, and Alan didn't mention this, but I think there is an issue with an older age group who perhaps do drink too much at home, and I think we shouldn't forget in our focus on alcohol misuse in the UK. This is one of my regrets about the heated debate around minimum pricing, is that we don't have enough focus on broader issues associated with people perhaps drinking too much wine at home of an evening, people drinking too much out when they go out with friends, not just this kind of binge drinking among 18 to 24-year-olds. But the licensing and availability issue is not proven to have contributed substantially to the pattern of consumption that we've got in the UK. The issue really is that from the 90s and early 2000s, there seemed to be a pattern, particularly amongst this younger age group, of drinking with the express purpose of getting drunk. Now, it is a minority.
Where does this come from?
But it's a group that we need to clearly focus at, and that's why the industry was engaged to try and communicate in a campaign to try and persuade them to change their behaviour. It is an issue, but we shouldn't convince ourselves that that's a problem affecting all people. It remains a minority in our society.
The question about where does that culture come from, and I think a lot of it can be placed at the feet of the alcohol
Is
industry.
it advertising?
Well, yeah, very much. I mean, I think a lot of it is around the way that alcohol is promoted, but its glamorous image, its links with the, sexual success, etc., etc. I know there are guidelines around that now, and I know the industry is trying to sort of is putting in sort of voluntary codes to try and cope with that, but not always successfully. And the industry is constantly trying to find ways around that. Most recently through using social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc., getting people to pass around sort of branding in various subtle ways.
I don't accept that's a way around the rules, incidentally. But
the argument basically is that the industry has very, very largely over the last 10, 20 years promulgated this whole notion amongst young people that in order to have a successful fun time, you've got to get sloshed, drunk, and that's putting it bluntly. And I think that's what's fueled this particular culture.
I don't accept that. I mean, before the programme started, we were talking about one of the challenges in this area of being how to communicate effectively about alcohol, because it's something that we all, or most of us, enjoy as part of a social life, and in moderation it's a pleasant and enjoyable thing.
Yep.
And so it presents challenges in how you communicate it to younger people. Now, I think there's a role here, and I'll come back to this issue with parents, about how we educate our young people. I know a fellow parent who has a 17-year-old child, and they have talked to them about alcohol and the risks of excessive consumption. Subsequently, they then pack them off to a rock festival with 20 cans of beer. Now, what message does that send? It sends perhaps a conflicting message, but of course many parents would say, well, that's what I did when I was 17. We have to get this right, and if you go to schools, what you find is that teachers are find it quite hard to educate children about two things: sex and alcohol. They find it far easier with drugs, funnily enough, because they believe that there's a clear message, it's illegal, these products are bad for you and so on. With sex and alcohol, they find it a challenge, and we've got to find a way around that.
What can the government do to address this wider issue? We've just had a new report out on the causes of last summer's London riots, where a group of experts highlighted that it was a range of factors, including a lack of opportunities for young people, a sense of hopelessness, and poor parenting that all contributed to the disturbances. To what extent is this true about the culture of binge drinking? And are we turning into a nanny state with these slightly overprotective policies, perhaps? How can we start implementing this on a wider scale, this social responsibility?
Sure.
James?
Yeah, I mean, you touch on a number of issues, and I think they're all relevant. That, as humans, we're very complex beings, and, we live in an environment of multiple levers and influences and so on. So, to say about, single policy measures, that whether they will solve or not solve the problem is too simplified. And the alcohol strategy, minimum pricing, was a part of a broader strategy. And my work through Alcohol Policy UK and the Alcohol Academy is about trying to make sure that we have what we call multi-component approaches. So it's where you have a number of different strategies working across different areas, and work with parenting is important. Parental influence is key in terms of being a good parent and giving your child life skills and giving them a sense of self-esteem and self-worth, and also the influence that parents have. That exactly as we were saying about who are the real binge drinkers. It's not just people in town centres beating each other up. I mean, there's a lot of people who regularly drink a couple of glasses of wine every night, and that's
or
a bottle, and that's a problem, and the influence that has without realising it. So there is other health policy interventions we can do. GPs and contacts with healthcare workers or social workers, they should be asking about alcohol use and feeding back to people if they're drinking at a level that could be harmful to their health, because as I mentioned, there's that kind of 20% of people who drink above the guidelines are not necessarily alcohol dependent or have a problem in the way most people people would see it, but they're unaware that they're drinking above the guidelines and placing themselves at a range of health risks. So personal feedback, targeted to people who are drinking at a risky level is an effective intervention. We know that, but we can't forget the national policy levers, which are pricing, availability and marketing, which is why price licensing and advertising comes in and is important.
What are the chances of the European Union ruling that government intervention on pricing is actually legal? And should it be illegal to intervene in the pricing of alcohol?
I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand these things. But I think, given that our Prime Minister has laid it down on the line that he wants this to happen, this is policy, I think we will find a way through. Now, the alcohol industry, a section thereof, have, not all of them, but have objected to this, and Gavin is an example of that. Now, but I think that the alcohol industry should look at this and say, look, this is a reasonable policy. It's not the complete answer. It's part of a spectrum. There is some evidence that this could have an effect, particularly on younger people. Let's be responsible, members of society as an industry. Let's show that we are responsible. We're not just all about profits. We also have a corporate responsibility. So let us go along with this. Let's give this a try, and let's try and make this work. Because if it does work, it will be brilliant for the health of the people of the country. So let's show we can do that. And that's what I would hope would happen.
I'm not sure it's wise for me to wait for Alan to give me my suggested key messages, but very helpful anyway, thank you. The answer to your question is I think that this is likely to be subject to legal challenge across Europe. Minimum pricing has been ruled illegal in a Dutch court in 1978. Previous legal judgments from the European Court of Justice would suggest that it is illegal. Our view is it is not justified or supported by the evidence. So we actually fundamentally disagree about that. There are plenty of areas from the discussion that we've had in the last half an hour where, frankly, we could agree on measures to tackle alcohol misuse. And I think it would be great if we could focus on those rather than this rather blunt weapon, which is going to put up prices for ordinary consumers.
But why is the industry so anti this? Because it's a reasonable thing to try.
We don't believe it's a reasonable thing. We believe it's actually disproportionate and will have implications for many responsible consumers of alcohol, whilst failing to tackle the real problem drinkers about which James spoke eloquently earlier on. And I think that what we need here is focused policy rather than policies which are determined to, frankly, reduce overall consumption when, as I said, overall consumption has gone down in recent years, yet we still have evidence of problems with illness.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Final thoughts?
Yes, I don't see why the industry should have the last word. I don't think that minimum pricing would affect overall consumption. I think it is a focused approach, and I think actually it's a reasonably fair approach, and I don't think would have much of an effect on the moderate drinker. And it's a few pounds a year we might add to the bit. We haven't decided even what the level of minimum pricing is yet, so that's to be discussed. But as a principle and as an approach, I would say it's a very good idea.
Thank you to all my guests. I was joined by James Morris from Alcohol Policy UK, Gavin Partington, Interim Chief Executive at the Wine and Spirit Trade Association, Professor Alan Marion Davis, Honorary Professor of Public Health from the Department of Public Health Sciences at King's College London, and on the phone from Russia we had Erkin Tuzmuhaimedov from Russia's Association of Sommeliers and an expert in Russia's alcohol traditions. Stay tuned, you're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Paulina Boyko, and we'll be back after the news. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Paulina Boyko, and today we're talking about the government's new alcohol strategy, in particular the introduction of minimum per unit pricing of alcohol. It's regarded as one of the biggest public health interventions in the UK in years. The government wants to set a minimum price of 40 pence per unit of alcohol and is considered a problem. Alan, what's your take on the situation?
Well, I think the binge drinking is very much a young person's thing. Certainly, not just middle classes, but actually more in lower income households, and a lot of binge drinking in the under 18s. We have an 18-year-old legal lowest age for drinking, but a lot of it goes on amongst school children as well. So that's a big issue, and it's still such a problem that something has to be done. And really, it centres on, if you look at the evidence, it centres on two main things: price and availability.
Interim Chief Executive at the Wine and Spirit Trade Association, and Professor Alan Marion Davis, Honorary Professor of Public Health from the Department of Public Health Sciences at King's College London. And on the phone from Russia, we have Erkin Tuzmuhamedov from Russia's Association of Sommeliers and an expert on Russia's alcohol traditions. So alcohol concerns say that 1 in 4 adults in the UK are binge drinkers. We keep seeing newspaper headlines about Booze Britain and the number of young people in particular who are abusing alcohol. How did this come about? And is minimum pricing going to be an effective way of tackling the problem?
In particular. And that particular group of young people, particularly the underage ones, don't have much disposable income. They're pretty poor, and the way they get their drink very largely is by going into supermarkets, stores where there are very cheap alcohol deals. Big offers, very generous offers. Sometimes at what we call pocket money prices. You can buy some strong white cider, which is an alcoholic apple drink, for less than the price of a bottle of water. Very, very cheap. And these young people
stricter control over advertising rules and multi-buy deals. There's been a mixed reaction to the coalition's efforts to tackle what David Cameron calls the scourge of violence caused by binge drinking. But is minimum pricing going to be effective? Some say that minimum pricing punishes everyone, the innocent and the guilty. And what about the responsible drinkers in the low-income bracket, who are about to experience a price hike? To discuss one of the biggest public health initiatives since Labour brought in the smoking ban back in 2006, I'm joined in the studio by James Morris from Alcohol Policy UK, Gavin Partington